Hope you're all having a great morning. Today we'll be discussing the origins, migrations, and transformations of the Germanic peoples. So, as is traditional for you guys who haven't been a part of these spaces before, I'd like to start back at the very, very beginning. So the Germanic peoples, just like the other peoples of Europe, their origins are, they're derived from a number of various races that were wandering around the world in the last ice age. You have the Western hunter-gatherers, who are this kind of tallish, swarthy race. Some of them had blue eyes. They were living in Italy and the Balkans. You had the Anatolian hunter-gatherers, who lived in what's known as the Asiatic part of Turkey. You had the ancestral North Eurasians. All the DNA samples we have from them are currently from kind of like Central Siberia area, around like Lake Baikal and Yakutia. But my strong suspicion is that the base of their population was in Central Asia, around the Aral Sea region. So you have these different groups, and in the last ice age, they're all intensely xenophobic. They don't really mix that much. They kind of murder each other whenever they come into contact. In any case, they're dealing a lot more with violent animals than they are with violent men. This is still, the megafauna are still around in a lot of areas. Now, as the ice age ends, there's of course a lot of different transformations. The great ice shelves that had blocked off a lot of Europe and Siberia from colonization, you start to have animals that migrate to the north, and all of a sudden you can go and you can fish in these rivers that connect the Arctic Sea, the Baltic, the Black Sea, and whatnot. So you have expansions of these different groups. The Western hunter-gatherers, they go and they take over Europe from the other hunter-gatherer groups, at least in France, England, Germany area. And you have these ancestral North Eurasians, and a number of them, they're migrating west from Central Asia or Siberia, and they're going kind of north of the forest line. The forest line, if you look at a map of Russia, there's kind of like Ukraine, southern Russia. It's very flat, it's very open, there's not much tree cover, but then north of a certain point, it's basically all forested. That's what I mean by the forest line. It's two very different ecologies. South of the forest line, you have your animals roaming around. They're the age of horses and cattle and everything. There's a big pastoral area. But back in the day, it was actually very depopulated. People couldn't make a living off the grasslands, so they kind of colonized the areas along like the Don River, the Dnieper River, and the Volga River. So you have these migrants coming in from Siberia and Central Asia. They're kind of following these riverine routes, and some of them are going north of the forest line, where they colonize all the way up to the Arctic Circle. Some of these groups, they go and they are like distinctive enough from the other ancestral nations, so we call them the Eastern Hunter-Gatherers, the EHGs. So the EHGs, they colonize everything north of the forest line by, I think, 8700 BC. So it takes them 1,000 years to populate this whole huge region of northern Russia. And some of them, they migrate into Scandinavia, where they collide with kind of the northern vanguard of the Western hunter-gatherers in what's nowadays Sweden. They mix together and they form a group called the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, or the SHGs. So you have the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers who are in Sweden and the northern part of Scandinavia. You have the Eastern hunter-gatherers who are dominating Russia north of the forest line. You have the Western hunter-gatherers who are dominating most of Europe proper. And you have some weird groups called the Magdalenians who seem to have had holdouts into maybe like the 8th millennium in Iberia. Those groups, they're kind of just doing whatever it is hunter-gatherers do. And you do have some groups south of the forest line where you have migrants who are crossing the Caucasus Mountains from what's nowadays Georgia and Azerbaijan. They're moving up along the Don, up in the Volga, and coming in contact with some of these eastern hunter-gatherers, and they're forming these new peoples. Some of them are called like steppe Neolithic, and it's a complicated topic for another space. So there is a fair amount of mixing actually among these fishing populations of southern Russia. So there's this huge change. There's culture in the Levant, like Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria area, starting right around the end of the last ice age, called the Natufians. And the Natufians, they go and they kind of discover not necessarily agriculture, but pre-agriculture, where you can not necessarily cultivate plants, but at least sow the seeds and then come back later to harvest them, for lack of a better description. And this is the beginning of the agricultural revolution. It's very much like it wasn't like a single takeoff. It was very sporadic. There were gradual improvements that came in fits and bursts of kind of innovations in agriculture, stock breeding, whatnot. So it took thousands and thousands of years for agriculture to really improve. And one of these groups that took off with the agriculture were these Anatolian hunter-gatherers. They became known as the Anatolian farmers once they kind of adopted this agricultural lifestyle from their southern neighbors with a surprisingly small amount of genetic admixture. Why that was is uncertain. But anyhow, they were incredibly successful and they started migrating. The population massively expands and they start expanding to the east into Iran, into the South Caucasus, and then into Europe as well, where they became known as the early European farmers, or the EEFs. So the EEFs, they cross over into the Balkans around 7000 BC. Don't really start taking off, though, until 6200 BC. And there's all these cataclysms around the world. One of those cataclysms was the Stregeslides. And the Stregeslides were this, it looks like a three-part collapsed continental shelf off the coast of Norway, which generated these huge tsunamis, which went all the way into the Scottish Highlands. They were clearly very devastating. They wiped out what was left of Doggerland. That was the land bridge that connected England to the European mainland back then, so kind of severing those populations from their cousins back on the continent. And there's other stuff too, like there's a lot of floods in the Danube. Looks like there were floods in the Persian Gulf as well. So a lot of crazy stuff going on. And the early European farmers seem to have taken advantage of this weakness of the Western hunter-gatherers. So they start pouring in Europe and they colonize a lot of the low West soil regions, which was kind of their very that was the limited ecology that they could colonize. They weren't as adept with stock breeding and with agriculture as later populations would be. So they colonized all the low West soil areas by about 5100 to 4900 BC. And they've kind of pushed all the Western hunter-gatherer populations to the periphery. And once they've colonized all the available regions, they kind of just start to decline. Their social system, social political system, was probably not that sophisticated. It was already extremely violent even before they ran out of available cropland. But just having that extra land that they could expand to, that they didn't necessarily have to fight the other early European farmers for, was clearly very important for their stability. Since their populations really start to seem to decline around 5000, 4900 BC, get into this weird Aztec pantheon where they start sacrificing each other and cannibalizing each other and all this really other horrible stuff. And the Neolithic was a very violent time, but they were, at least from the osteological record, looking at their bones and everything, the most violent society that's ever existed. Now, of course, the sources of bones we have for them aren't necessarily going to be repetitive. So is that actually true? There's a lot of debates about it. But I think just given the ecological constructions, an unreasonable assumption to make. There are, even the Aztecs, for instance, did have agricultural surpluses and all of that. So I do think the issue with the early European farmers in that pretty dark period was not necessarily unique, but certainly unusually violent, even by the standards of the Neolithic. So they're in decline for a few centuries, and around the 45th century BC, there's all these different convulsions, which just massively affected all of Western Eurasia, really. Why that is not really understood. I've read a fair amount about the era. I haven't figured it out. I don't even think anyone's come up with a solid theory. It is interesting, though, that you start to see copper metallurgy taking off in certain places, like the Carpathian Mountains in the North Caucasus, in Mesopotamia, right, in the preceding centuries. So it's possible that these Western hunter-gatherer populations that were kind of living on the periphery of the early European, in the mountains, on the coasts and whatnot, now that the copper mines were a source of power and wealth for whatever reason, that destabilized whatever the political system was and enabled, these great conquests. So you have these coastal populations and mountain populations, the Western hunter-gatherers. They go and they overrun a lot of these early European farmer societies. And the one that's important there's actually two that are important for, the early Germanic populations. There's one called the globular amphoras. They're formed as you have kind of these Western hunter-gatherers living on the coast of what's nowadays northwestern Poland area. They go and they overrun the early European farmers of southern Poland. They kind of set themselves up as a ruling class. They contribute maybe, I think it's 25% roughly of the ancestry, about 80% of the male lineages. So it's very much one of those, kill a lot of the men, take the women captive kind of things. So that's the glaboras, and then you have the funnel beakers, who I think were about 15% Western hunter-gatherer in ancestry and about 85% early European farmer in ancestry. And they were descended from the Western hunter-gatherers who were kind of living in Frisia, the Netherlands, parts of the northeastern French coast around Calais. And they'd had very, very hostile relations with the early early European farmers prior to the 45th century. The only items that are known to be in each other's settlements are actually just axes, like these stone axes that they would use probably to kill each other. Because there's no signs of like genetic admixture or anything before that, no signs of trade of any kind. So these were just intensely, racist and xenophobic societies. And we don't really have equivalents, I think, in the anthropological record, outside of maybe the American Southwest, where the names that a lot of the people would have for other groups was just like the enemies or like the ancient enemies. And they would just call themselves the people because they didn't consider anyone else to be really human. And my suspicion is that kind of was what the relations between the Western hunter-gatherers and the early European farmers were like prior to this 45th century upheaval. So this 45th century upheaval, you have the formation of the funnel beakers from the Western hunter-gatherers who were conquering the early European farmers in the Low Countries. And you have the globular amphoras who are formed from the Western hunter-gatherers of northern Poland, conquering the earlier parts of southern Poland. Those are the two groups that are relevant. And they go and they form these synthetic cultures. They're actually a lot better than either the Western hunter-gatherer, like fishing, gathering culture, but also better than kind of like the very basic stock breeding with like pigs and stuff. As well as like agricultural toolkit of the early European farmers. So rather than just being able to exploit like only the low S soils or only like lacustrine environments, all of a sudden they're able to exploit both of them. They're spreading like the technology for the fish hooks. They're experimenting with new ways of storing their animals in enclosures. So there's all these innovations. They're not necessarily becoming more technologically innovative in the sense that they have like new tools and stuff that they can use to shape their environment, but they're definitely becoming a lot more culturally sophisticated by this era of upheaval. And it results in this population boom that enables them to colonize a lot more areas than they used to be. So the globular amphoras, they stretch down into like nowadays Czechoslovakia, parts of like Belarus and Ukraine. You have the funnel beakers, and they go and they move into colonize Denmark. Other groups of mixes of the Western hunter-gatherers and the early European farmers, they go and settle Britain and Ireland. And they kind of sweep aside the remaining hunter-gatherer groups in a lot of areas. At the same time, the explanation for kind of the copper metallurgy explaining this big upheaval doesn't really work because you see these huge shifts in areas that did not have copper. For instance, in the Baltic, which was a largely Western hunter-gatherer population prior to the 45th century, you see these migrations of these Eastern hunter-gatherers, the EHGs, that are also moving into what's nowadays Latvia and Estonia in large numbers during that period. They seem to have basically eliminated all of the Western hunter-gatherers of Estonia and replaced a substantial population, maybe like half of the population of Latvia, maybe like a third of that of what's nowadays Lithuania. And it's very complicated because it looks like the Western hunter-gatherers on the coast around like the Curonian Lagoon, like the Memel, that whole area. It looks like the Western hunter-gatherers, they had the Narva and the post-Narva cultures there. It looks like they held out there, and they kind of like pushed back against the Eastern hunter-gatherers and the like Eastern hunter-gatherer, Western hunter-gatherer mixes just for like the next 2,000 years or so. So it's very, very difficult to get a sense for what was going on there. But again, there's a lot of signs of intense xenophobia and what have you. There's places that are only like 500 miles apart or 500 kilometers apart, and there's like no signs of contact between them at all for like 1,000 years. So you have these like very xenophobic hunter-gatherer and fishing groups that are really resistant to the outside world, and because there's not really agriculture involved, there's no spread of relatively like by the standards of the time, cosmopolitan ideologies. So again, you just have these groups that are like warring each other over what very limited resources there are in the Baltic, and this becomes fairly important later on. So the globular amphoras, they like gradually try to push into Lithuania and parts of eastern Latvia. It's very, very slow for them. Their culture doesn't really get picked up until it's far, far too late. At the same time, the 45th century, you also have convulsions in the Caucasus and kind of southern Russia, that steppe area, with the formation of a very famous group of people called the Indo-Europeans. And the Indo-Europeans, they most of their ancestry was a mix of like the Eastern hunter-gatherers and the Caucasian hunter-gatherers, who probably came together like right around the end of the last ice age, when you have the Caucasian hunter-gatherers that are migrating north from the Caucasus Mountains, and then the Eastern hunter-gatherers are migrating west from Central Asia. So that's the bulk of their ancestry. However, there were a number of different groups. Like there were some other like very odd groups with ties to very different groups in Siberia and Central Asia that were wandering around at the time too. So it wasn't like necessarily a guarantee that one of those populations was going to win out. It looks like around the 45th century, you have this migration of a group through Abkhazia and along the kind of coast of what's nowadays the Kuban that goes and mixes and adds maybe like 10% of the ancestry to this Caucasian hunter-gatherer, Eastern hunter-gatherer mix, and it forms the Indo-Europeans. And it's also interesting because the R1b Y haplogroup, the Y haplogroup is what's passed down from a father to all of his sons. It coalesced in around the 45th century BC. So it looks like there was, some sort of warlord. He, conquered the, whatever tribes were in the area, and they kind of mixed together, and that's the original Indo-European Yamnaya, whatever you want to call it, population, right around there in the 45th century BC. So there's clearly this massive catastrophe that's affecting all of Western Eurasia, and it shows up in the Middle East. We have the Ubaid society. There's a noticeable decline in archaeological sites right around the 45th century, and it's not for another 2 or 3 centuries that the area really seems to start to recover. So obviously there was something huge going on. What it was, I'm not sure if we'll ever know. It's worth theorizing about in the future. So that's kind of the stages set. You have, the earliest Indo-Europeans. They're living in kind of like Kalmykia, the Donbass area, over to where Stalingrad, Volgograd, Astrakhan are. You have these all these different groups around in the Baltic. You have the Eastern hunter-gatherers in Estonia. You have the Eastern hunter-gatherer, Western hunter-gatherer mixes in Latvia and in the interior. And then you have still these Western hunter-gatherers hanging out along the coastal fringe. In Scandinavia, you start to see, with this population boom of the funnel-beaker people, they start pressing into Denmark, where they overrun the Western hunter-gatherers there, largely replacing the population. And they start to spread, I think, around 3700 BC into southern Sweden, where they come into contact with those Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, which I mentioned earlier. And those Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, they were also very based around fishing. They tended to emphasize kind of a coastal lifestyle. And for several hundred years, they really resisted interacting with these intrusive funnel-beaker people. Now, the funnel-beaker people, they go, and there's kind of this broader ecological downturn around 3600 BC that affects really all of Europe. It's possible that the first plague spread through Europe around that time. So there's the plague explanation. There's an explanation for there's no exhaustion of soils. Could just be ecological too. The Sahara really starts to dry up right around 3700, 3600 BC. So clearly a lot going on, but the funnel beakers, they're definitely hit quite severely by it and kind of stagnate for a few centuries until around 3300 BC when they really start to decline. It looks like their position in southern Sweden just totally collapses after about 3300 BC, and the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers just go and largely not necessarily wipe them out, but push them out of southern Sweden and into Denmark. The Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, who are by that point called a pitted ware culture, they do incorporate a number of the funnel-beaker people into their population. So I think the later pitted ware Scandinavian hunter-gatherer people, 20% funnel-beaker in ancestry, maybe 10%. Again, I think there's only 2 or 3 samples. It's not very many. So those could possibly be unrepresentative. So the funnel beakers, they're in retreat, going back to Denmark and the Danish Isles. And you also have some, I think, Baltic at the same time too, where you have kind of this resurgence of these coastal Western hunter-gatherer populations as they go and they push into the interior for whatever reason. But the really big story of 3300 BC is, not these kind of movements of these peoples who are now long, long gone, but the adoption of dairying among the Indo-Europeans and kind of the southern western steppe region of Russia. That's the region between Nemets, Volgograd, and Don. And so those people, they discover dairying. Dairying's not new. It is new for them, but it had been around for thousands of years in the early European farmer society. So they adopt dairying, and all of a sudden they're able to exploit all these grasslands. You can have your cattle graze around in the grasslands. They'll drink the water from the stream, and they can convert it into milk, which is a way that humans can get calories from this stuff. It seems like the Indo-Europeans could not drink the milk itself, but they would go and turn it into dairy products like cheese, yogurt, whatever, just like a lot of other steppe peoples. And that enabled them to kind of exploit the southern steppe region and enable this population boom. So some groups of these Indo-Europeans of the Yamnaya culture, they go and they collide with the globular amphora people, in kind of like northern Ukraine, Belarus area, and they formed the corded ware culture. The corded ware culture is very much like a barbarian culture. They were like semi-nomadic. It looks like they herded cattle like across large distances seasonally, which was just the way that you could get calories and nutrients from a grassland that otherwise wasn't particularly fertile. So you have this development of the corded ware culture, and around 3000 BC, you see this massive explosion of this corded ware culture where, they conquer everything all the way to the Rhine, in a space of less than 200 years. So between 3000 and 2800 BC, all of a sudden everything, basically the Dnieper to the Rhine River, so like Poland, Germany, Belarus, Slovakia, Czechia, all these areas are just totally overrun. There's mass destruction, chaos, all this stuff. So very clearly, something very, very bad happened for the globular amphoras and for the funnel beakers. From what it looks like from the Y chromosomes was, a warlord who had carried the R1A haplogroup, who presumably united these disparate Indo-European tribes, and he was kind of like the Genghis Khan of the 31st or 30th century BC, and he just kind of united them and drove all before him with his armies of cart-mounted infantry who would dismount to go and kind of just like gradually raid areas, murder most of the people, and turn it into grazing land for his cattle. So a pretty dark era, and this affected Scandinavia as well. You have this group called the battle axe culture, or which goes and kind of sweeps into southern Sweden, to Denmark and parts of Norway and Finland, and they kind of take over that area. Now, the battle axe culture was fairly closely related but distinct to southern corded ware groups that were living like along the Rhine, along the Danube, and both of those two groups were quite a bit more distinctive from the kind of like pure Yamnaya people. And this links up with the languages, the branches of Indo-European that would be spoken. It looks like the people who were in like Germany and Czechia were speaking the ancestral languages of Italic and Celtic, as well as some unknown Indo-European languages that haven't survived. The Yamnaya people, who are still living in like eastern Ukraine and southern Russia, were speaking the languages ancestral to Albanian, Greek, and Armenian. And meanwhile, like kind of the more eastern corded ware people were hanging out in like eastern Poland, Belarus, and kind of like the more central parts of Russia around like Moscow and the Kama River and everything. They were speaking the ancestors of Germanic, Slavic, and Iranian, as well as Baltic. So some of those groups, the key one that we're thinking about today, the kind of ancestors, the Germanics, they actually pressed into the Baltic following the path of these globular amphora people. So the corded ware people, they have a decent amount of their ancestry, very specifically from the globular amphora, early European farmer people, maybe I think like 30%, 25-30% roughly. And so they go and they actually press into what's nowadays like Latvia, kind of the coastal area of Lithuania, not so much Estonia at this point, and this is around 2700 BC. These groups, they're very pastoral, they're based around kind of cattle and everything, and they don't necessarily have the cultural toolkit to be able to exploit these Baltic ecologies that well. So rather than kind of conquering and murdering everyone, they actually some of them get absorbed into the local culture of some of these Baltic peoples. And it looks like very specifically it was of the kind of even like 50% Eastern hunter-gatherer, 50% Western hunter-gatherer mix that dominated the central part of Latvia, at least around 4000 BC, which appears to have kind of annexed the area in what's nowadays like coastal Latvia. And Stony Trobolist actually has a pretty good blog post on it that I can send. I'll post again after I finish the space. So at this point, and this part is actually quite speculative, I think there's some unsampled people from this. It's the Latvia Middle Neolithic 1 sample. That's the one that matches up best with my personal theory. I think there's a group of this people, and they were carrying haplogroup I1, which is a very rare haplogroup. It occurs, I think, in one of the pitted ware Scandinavian hunter-gatherer samples. It appears in a Western hunter-gatherer sample from, I think, Czechia around like 5000 BC. And it hasn't been found in the Baltic yet, but my suspicion is that there will be found a guy with the I1 haplogroup within this kind of mixed Western hunter-gatherer, Eastern hunter-gatherer group from Middle Neolithic Latvia. Because this is when you start to see kind of the mixing between these corded-ware Indo-Europeans and these local Baltic populations, kind of in the early to mid 3rd millennium BC. And I think this is really when the Germans start to become their own relatively distinctive population. This is when haplogroup I1, which is very distinctive within the Germanic peoples, kind of gets introgressed into their population. So you have these Germanic people, they're forming from these mixtures within the Baltic, and even with mixing with these Baltic populations, they're still not the kings of the Baltic yet. They're still like, the Eastern hunter-gatherers who are hanging out in Estonia, especially along the coasts, and so they're not dominant by any means. And that's a similar story with their cousins, this lost Indo-European group, the Battle Axe people, who are across the Baltic Sea in Denmark and in southern Sweden. They haven't necessarily wiped out the pitted ware Scandinavian hunter-gatherer populations yet. We're definitely persisting along the coastline. Now, this seems to change around the 23rd century BC, and there's all these different upheavals all over the world as a result, most likely, of a climate shift. The Sahara gets a lot drier at that point. You see kind of like these migrations down from the Sudan into Somalia. You see, the collapse of these civilizations in Iberia, Italy. It's, there's like waves of Indo-European invaders that kind of march in to take advantage of the disintegrating civilizations. Since, of course, like when your economy is based around cattle pastoralism, you're going to be able to exploit more marginal lands than a farmer would. You don't necessarily need the irrigation that a farmer does, reliability of rainfall, all of that. You really just need, stray cattle, and you need, some grass. So there's all these upheavals going on. It looks like it affected the Baltic as well. There does seem to be an increase in meltwater that's flowing into the Baltic, so that might have caused kind of this like saline shock to a lot of these fish populations, which we used to, would have been more saltwater inflowing to the Baltic Sea, so it might have caused like a saline shock to a lot of these fish who are used to living in kind of the fresher water that was, brought in by rainfall, as well as from the rivers in Eastern and Northern Europe. So it might have just been like the fishermen that were weakened because the fish populations declined. The Indo-European groups, they were only partially reliant on fishing, and still had their kind of like cattle pastoral model of life, supplemented with some agriculture, benefited. But it really seems like that was when Europeans, the Baltic, the Proto-Germano-Baltic Slavs, really triumphed in the area. So at the same time in Scandinavia, the Battle Axe people, they have their own issues, and a group from probably what's nowadays like northern Germany, Frisia, the Netherlands, it's also Indo-European. They go and actually invade Scandinavia. They apparently like wiped out a good chunk of the population. Their men largely carried the R1b haplogroup rather than the R1a haplogroup carried by the Battle Axe people, and they kind of ruled Scandinavia for maybe 300 years. And this is when the Germans kind of move over to Scandinavia. So it's probably around like 1900 to 1700 BC. There is this spread of this new culture. There's new burial customs, new weapons that do appear to spread from the Eastern Baltic, like the Latvia area, first into kind of like southeastern central Sweden, and then to Norway, mainland, like the Jutland Peninsula, part of Denmark, and then finally the islands of Denmark. And this is what shows up genetically, is this group of people with these Eastern affinities, specifically that Middle Neolithic Latvian population, as would have been maybe like 10% of the ancestry of these new invaders from the East. Other than that, they would have been the usual Indo-European globular amphora mix. So they crossed the Baltic Sea. They largely replaced the population of Sweden, Norway, and maybe like I think half the population of Jutland Peninsula, and I think about 40% of the population of kind of the Danish islands. And that is what I believe is kind of the spread of the Germanic languages. It wasn't like a single great conquest by any means. The dates, the mixture appear to be pretty broad, all the way from like 1800 or 1900 BC, all the way down to like 1300 BC. But it does look like this kind of early Germanic expansion was, contemporary with the spread of what's called the Nordic Bronze Age. You have, the rise of bronze metalworking, and especially after 1500 BC, the integration in these kind of international trade networks. And so after 1500 BC, you see the population really starts to pick up again. People have been recovered, kind of the area recovered largely from the big environmental crisis from around 2200 BC. And, that's when you go and you see kind of like the earliest, warlords. You have them build like the great warrior lodges, the longhouses, as some people want to call them, which I don't think there's ever been a period where it was a really genuinely feminist institution. They build like the giant burial mounds. You have kind of like a sun cult that's going around. Interestingly, there seems to have been, and this is another reason why I think there were, the branch for Indo-European, it would be, Germano, Balto-Slavo-Iranic. You do see like there's some sculptures that vaguely resemble yoga poses. And there's some arguments. There's contacts between, these Iranian populations, which were in touch with, very distantly with India, that still had contacts with, Bronze Age Scandinavia all the way, until maybe like 1600 or 1500 BC. So Scandinavia was, increasingly integrated into a broader world. There's definitely more cosmopolitanism than there had been in the Stone Age, the Neolithic, especially more than the hunter-gatherer ages, the Mesolithic. At the same time, though, their big thing was they would export amber. There's a lot of amber in the Baltics, as well as kind of, parts of nowadays like Poland and stuff. So they would kind of, they'd raid, they'd take that stuff, export it down to, down like the Vistula River, or they'd bring it down like the Elbe, and it would end up in Italy. There were some finds of people who were very clearly from Scandinavia down in, I think, what's nowadays like Venetia or Slovenia, I think around 1300 BC. So there have been some arguments about contacts between the Mycenaeans and the Nordic Bronze Age, like Scandinavians, the like earliest Germanics. I don't know if there were necessarily direct contacts, but there very clearly were at least indirect contacts between late Bronze Age Scandinavia and the Mycenaean civilization of Greece. I know there's some thinkers who attribute the kind of berserker concept, they think it existed in the Bronze Age, and that there's signs in the Middle East in the late Bronze Age of kind of like berserkers from the north being brought in as mercenaries. I think it's certainly possible. It's not unreasonable given what we know about the long distance contacts at the time. But it's not something that's been confirmed, and I kind of go back and forth on it. So the Bronze Age collapse happens. It's a huge catastrophe everywhere. It looks like it affected Scandinavia as well. The size of the burial mounds really declines, which shows that the chief's not as powerful as it used to be. He can't force people to work for him in the afterlife as much as he could back in like the 15, 14, 1300s. Bronze Age collapse is about 1200 BC, by the way. And you do see some kind of like tentative efforts at expansion, like there's parts of Western Latvia that look like, the people from Scandinavia like migrated over there, tried to set up a colony, and it failed. Possibly because the Finno-Ugrians show up and, take over. But I think that would have been around 900 or 800 BC. So it's difficult to say. So the Germans, they're kind of like cooped up in Scandinavia, and it's not, starting in like 800 BC with the Iron Age. It's not the Iron Age there yet. It's still the Bronze Age. They start to like colonize parts of northern Poland, northern Germany as well. Northern Germany back at the time was inhabited by people who were most closely related to the Irish rather than modern Germans. And at some point between 800 BC and 300 BC, it looks like they basically got wiped out by the expanding Germans. Further south, you have, like in Bavaria, Czechia, you have these Celtic populations who are actually attested to in Roman sources. And they're most closely related to people, like modern-day French people, basically, not to modern-day German people. And with the kind of expansion of the Germans, like with you start to have the Cimbri in the first century BC. They're expanding south. There's like more and more waves of Germans. They go, and they're not like as displaced as the people in northern Germany were, but there is quite a substantial amount of displacement with kind of these migrants from the north replacing about 2/3 of the population between the first century BC and the 4th century AD. So you've got all these big changes. And at the same time, you have kind of like a split between the Western Germanic peoples and the Eastern Germanic peoples fairly early on. The Western Germanic peoples would be like, the English, the Germans, the Dutch, the Frisians, and you have the East Germanics, which are the Goths, the Vandals, the more famous barbarian tribes usually. So the Eastern Germans, they have the stronger kind of Eastern affinities. They have more of that kind of like Middle Neolithic Latvian, that 50% Western hunter-gatherer, 50% Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry in them. Whereas the Western Germans, they have more of that ancestry from the people on the Danish Isles who, for a lot of reasons, like don't seem to have been, they were only like half replaced during, the Germanic expansion during the second millennium BC. They weren't, like totally wiped out like the people in, Eastern Sweden were. So there were probably some like extant variations, within the kind of Proto-Germanic populations, even before Proto-Germanic was spoken, and after the Proto-Germanic split into West, East, and North. North would be like Icelandic, Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish. You still do see, these very old differences kind of did, as they were united at the end of the Bronze Age, things split again with kind of the rise of iron, and you see Proto-Germanic break into those three branches. So the Eastern Germanics, the Goths, the Vandals, they migrate to the east, and they actually go and they overrun Poland. Looks like they largely replace the population there, and then spread into Ukraine, where they form the Cherniahov or Cherniahiv culture, which is kind of the original Gothic kingdom that is mentioned by, I believe, Jordanus is the writer. He was a 4th century Roman writer who wrote a history of the Goths. The Germans, they lost all their historical memory for reasons I'll discuss later. So, the Goths, they destructively move into Ukraine, and, they set up their kingdom there. And it looks like the kingdom did include like a number of, a lot of people were just straight up Goths, but it also included people from the Eastern Balkans too. There's a number of recent finds from, his paper was just published like a week and a half ago, of people who appeared genetically to be Thracians from like what's nowadays Bulgaria area, as well as a woman who, curiously enough, is from either Anatolia or the Levant, and appears to be associated with the glass blowing industry and the Carpathians. So the Gothic kingdom, even though they were barbarians, it looks like they were incorporated into these kind of Eastern Mediterranean, Black Sea trade routes, and they did have like these kind of cosmopolitan town populations, which would provide had the skilled artisans necessary to kind of sustain their economy. In any case, it wasn't to last. You have the crisis of the 3rd century. There's just the kind of climate shifts that were occurring towards the end of the Roman Empire, and Ukraine is unfortunately quite vulnerable to this. So with declining crop yields, with migrations of fierce peoples from the east, the Huns most noticeably, you start to see the Goths as they sweep into the Balkans and kind of rampage across Italy and all this other stuff. So the Huns are a really major part of the Germanic story, since they appear to have wholly eradicated any type of ancestral memory of the Germans. You start to see when the Huns kind of pour into Europe. The Huns were a Turkic-speaking populations, most likely the Chuvash people of kind of like central Russia along the Volga. They are probably the closest living people to the Huns, and have a lot of Hunnic ancestry themselves. So when they sweep into Europe in the 4th century, it looks like they set off the chain of reaction. Set off these chain reactions, which totally devastated a lot of Eastern and Central Europe. You have all these people that are migrating everywhere. And in Denmark, they construct their kind of big wall with Germany is constructed around that time. So even though like Jordanus and earlier Tacitus, 1st century AD, had records of parts of Germanic history, none of those were remembered in Germanic folklore at all. The earliest memories, that survive within kind of the Germanic historical, tradition, are from like the ring cycle and all that, are from around the time of Attila the Hun. I think Etzel is Attila. Within the ring cycle. So all the stuff from before the 4th century just gets totally obliterated in the Germanic historical memory, just as a result of all these migrations. The Germans, they scatter across, everywhere basically. Some of them go on, you have the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons from kind of, Frisia, northwestern Germany, southern part of Denmark, Jutland area. They migrate, they conquer England, and they form England, replacing maybe about a quarter to a third of the population. In England, you have, the Goths, the Suebi, all these other groups, that sweep through, northern Italy, Spain, and North Africa. Some of them end up in, Anatolia and the Byzantines as well. So these populations, they're pretty destructive, as the story for a lot of Germanic history. And they have the interesting effect, though, where they kind of re-northernize a lot of, the Mediterranean. The Romans were a very cosmopolitan group. They brought a lot of people from the east to settle in the west as the result of the West's devastation and the various wars of the 2nd and 1st century BC. So a lot of these diverse urban populations that the Romans had all died off during the collapse of the Roman Empire. And you have these migrations of the Germans in these newly depopulated regions, and they kind of likely restore the amount of Indo-European ancestry that those places had to the level that they had been at during the Bronze Age. That's certainly the case in northern Italy, to a lesser extent Spain. In Spain, we do see kind of the preservation of some of the more cosmopolitan populations, at least in the east, which had been kind of heavily settled, around like the Tarragona, Barcelona, that whole area region. There's some places like Bulgaria where it's noticeable, where there's certain parts of Western Bulgaria where the Gothic settlement is still obvious, just from the Y chromosomal lineages. There's the R1A branch that's like very specifically linked to the Goths that's common in Western Bulgaria. I think it's also found in like some other parts of Serbia and whatnot. So a lot of the Slavic migrations, they appeared to have included not necessarily to have included, but to have absorbed some of the Germanic groups which had settled in the Balkans prior to their great expansion. So as we get up to the Middle Ages, the population of Germany specifically seems to have gotten south shifted at some point in the medieval or early modern era. There really aren't that many DNA samples from Germany, since the German government doesn't like funding that sort of thing. But it does look like you go and you see like maybe like 10% of the ancestors of modern Germans are like basically Slavs or Balts. You see maybe like 30% are from those Eastern and Western Germans who migrated south from Scandinavia during kind of the very end of the Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age. And then around like half the ancestry is from, like kind of like it's modeled best as the, people who were there during the Celtic era. So that could mean a couple of things. It could mean that the Carolingian period, when the Franks went and conquered France, you have kind of this migration of these Latin people as they're brought east. They, kind of settle the lands that Charlemagne and his relatives are opening up, and then gradually get Germanized for a variety of reasons. It could be that the 30 Years' War proved to be so devastating that you have kind of like the repopulation of a lot of Germany by migrants, Protestants fleeing like Catholic persecution in Austria and in France and in Italy, or it could just mean that in the Middle Ages there was a relatively high amount of, just peaceful gene flow as the result of trade, internal migrations, economic dislocations, whatnot. And that's somewhat the story suggested by Italian DNA. Actually, do have kind of like a gradual north shift of Italian populations during the High Middle Ages. So ultimately, at the end of the day, there's more research needed. There are some interesting outlier German groups, like I know the Baltic Germans, the Germans who are actually still overrepresented within the kind of upper classes of Estonia. They appear actually to have very little, like, air quotes, actual German ancestry. It looks like they're just largely Germanized Estonians with some kind of like continental ancestry added on top of that, which kind of lines up with a history where you have like the Germans were very limited within the Baltic to these urban populations, tended to get wiped out every time there was a war. But you still had like there was still a niche for people who could speak German within those trade cities. So you'd have like Estonians from noble families and whatever who would like learn German, and they'd eventually adopt German names, German religion, everything, and become German after a certain amount of time. But at the same time, the DNA shows that they're still largely Estonian ancestry. That shows up actually too in some of the Russian German populations, where they have like noticeable amounts of Siberian ancestry, just like the Baltic Germans. They're mixing in with like Udmurts or Mordvins or whatever. So that was interesting too. So I got done a couple minutes early. I know that was a lot to cover in 53 minutes, but I will open it up for comments and questions now. Hello, Tony. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, hey, I just had a question about I don't know, like a little more clarification on there's like a cultural eradication, reset, whatever you want to call it, pre Attila the Hun, and yeah, I just wanted more clarification on that.
Sure. So you have, like in Tacitus and in Jordanus, you have all these references to various aspects of Germanic or Gothic history that appear to have just been totally forgotten. And what we do know from like the German folk memory is just the ring cycle, really. There's not much anything before the ring cycle, which suggests that it was really just Attila who, going in and causing all this population dislocations, ended a lot of historical or cultural transmission around that time in the 4th century.
Cool, thanks.
Bit Pundit, what is your question or comment? Bit Pundit, are you there?
Yeah, weird audio thing. It finally switched over. Yeah, so similarly, same time period, I guess, popped out to me. So, what did you mention? What we can tell genetically from the invasion of the Huns? Like, how did that change the German population? And and did that contribute to the forgetting? I guess.
I don't think it affected the actual like genetics of the population in Germany proper, but it clearly expelled the Germans from Ukraine. Like the Goths all, um, they fled to the Balkans. It looks like in Poland they presumably got wiped out by the advancing Slavs.
Okay, so they were pushed out of Eastern Europe towards the Danube and the Rhine.
Yes. So basically, what the historical sources say. Anyone else? Horrific Hierophant, you are good to speak. Horrific Hierophant, are you there? I guess not. Ian Perry, are you there?
Oh, sorry. I don't know what was going on. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I have sort of two questions. So you mentioned that the German population in the High Middle Ages and the Early Middle Ages became more south shifted. Do you think that could potentially just be a result of like post-Roman people taken back by these tribes? So like you have the Franks in France, the Ostrogoths and Lombards in Italy. That like if some of them return to Germany, like they bring back like people with Southern European ancestry with them. Do you think that could possibly explain that shift?
Yeah, that's definitely possible. Like the Saxons, for instance, I think there's a record of like 50,000 of them migrating north after the Lombards took over to kind of join their relatives. And that's, I didn't really get into it in this talk too, but that's the pattern that appears a couple times in the Bronze Age, or like when the ancestors of the Italics and the kind of like Cisalpine Celts migrate south. There is a shift, like kind of like a south shift among their home populations at the same time.
And I think it would make sense. Like we probably need more genetic samples.
Yeah, like a lot of the stuff I think is from 6 samples in all of southern Germany. So
And my, my,
story
sec-
can and will change.
my second question is just about what you talked about at the beginning. Is there any Scandinavian hunter-gatherer ancestry left in any population around today? Because I've heard some pretty conflicting things. Like at first I heard no, is basically none. But in Razib Khan's most recent article about the German people, he said that it's like 10%. So I'm just wondering what your thought is based on what you've read.
My understanding, if he's in here, he can correct me, is that he was using like the QPM or the QPADM method. So, when he was using that, he was kind of using the distal ancestry for like the Eastern hunter-gatherer, Western hunter-gatherer, and using those, as signals for the Scandinavian hunter-gatherer population. Hello, Tony. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, hey, I just had a question about I don't know, like a little more clarification on there's like a cultural eradication, reset, whatever you want to call it, pre-Attila the Hun, and yeah, I just wanted more clarification on that.
Sure. So you have, like in Tacitus and in Jordanus, you have all these references to various aspects of Germanic or Gothic history that appear to have just been totally forgotten. And what we do know from like the German folk memory is just the ring cycle, really. There's not much anything before the ring cycle, which suggests that it was really just Attila who, going in and causing all this population dislocations, ended a lot of, historical or cultural transmission around that time in the 4th century.
Cool, thanks.
Bit Pundit, what is your question or comment? Bit Pundit, are you there?
Yeah, weird audio thing. I finally switched over. Yeah, so similarly, same time period, I guess, popped out to me. So, what did you mention? What we can tell genetically from the invasion of the Huns? Like, how did that change the German population? And and did that contribute to the forgetting? I guess.
I don't think it affected the actual like genetics of the population in Germany proper, but it clearly expelled the Germans from Ukraine. Like the Goths all, they fled to the Balkans. It looks like in Poland they presumably got wiped out by the advancing Slavs.
Okay, so they were pushed out of Eastern Europe towards the Danube and the Rhine.
Yes. So basically, what the historical sources say. Anyone else? Horrific Hierophant, you are good to speak. Horrific Hierophant, are you there? I guess not. Ian Perry, are you there?
Oh, sorry. I don't know what was going on. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I have sort of two questions. So you mentioned that the German population in the High Middle Ages and the Early Middle Ages became more south shifted. Do you think that could potentially just be a result of like post-Roman people taken back by these tribes? So like you have the Franks in France, the Ostrogoths and Lombards in Italy. That like if some of them return to Germany, like they bring back like people with Southern European ancestry with them. Do you think that could possibly explain that shift?
Yeah, that's definitely possible. Like the Saxons, for instance, I think there's a record of like 50,000 of them migrating north after the Lombards took over to kind of join their relatives. And that's, I didn't really get into it in this talk too, but that's the pattern that appears a couple times in the Bronze Age, or like when the ancestors of the Italics and the kind of like Cisalpine Celts migrate south. There is a shift, like kind of like a south shift among their home populations at the same time.
I think it would make sense. Like we probably need more genetic samples.
Yeah, like a lot of the stuff I think is from 6 samples in all of southern Germany. So
And
Story can and will change.
my second question is just about what you talked about at the beginning. Is there any Scandinavian hunter-gatherer ancestry left in any population around today? Because I've heard some pretty conflicting things. Like at first I heard no, it's basically none. But in Razib Khan's most recent article about the German people, he said that it's like 10%. So I'm just wondering what your thought is based on what you've read.
My understanding, if he's in here, he can correct me, is that he was using like the QPM or the QPADM method. So, when he was using that, he was kind of using the distal ancestry for like the Eastern hunter-gatherer, Western hunter-gatherer, and using those, as signals for the Scandinavian hunter-gatherer population. For the more recent Germanic paper, though, they were using IB, identity by descent, analysis, which strongly suggested that ancestry, kind of the excess ancestry they have, relative to other Indo-Europeans, is specifically from that Middle Neolithic Latvia 1 population, not from the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers. So, I'll let the geneticists argue about it. My understanding is the IBD stuff is more reliable than the QPM ADM or the QPADM stuff for, this kind of analysis. I do think, though, that the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers still have like a noticeable amount of ancestry in the Sami.
That makes sense. Thank you.
I think, Ian, you wanted to speak? Ian Perry, right there. Guess not. No comment. 1, 2, 3, 4. You were good to speak. It's telling me there's an error. I can't add you as a guest.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't realize the moods being worked. So would you consider the idea that I-1 had originated in Scandinavia ruled out, like as a possible origin, or is that still kind of up in the air?
It's up in the air. That's honestly one of the things that I struggle with. Because I think kind of like everyone else, I'd assumed that, prior to this Germanic paper being released, the main assumptions were there's like an unsampled I1 from globular amphoras that got kind of like introgressed into, one of these Indo-European groups, because we know that, the Indo-Europeans intermarried with globular amphora quite a bit early on. And there are like I1 haplogroups in Central Europe. And then there was the theory, because there's like 1 or 2 I1 samples from Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, like, okay, maybe they took over the, Scandinavian population at one point and just kind of spread from there. Stuff, though, like, neither of those really makes sense, because now we have, I think, something like 60 samples from Scandinavia in the Bronze Age, and none of them have I1 prior to, I think, like 1900 BC, other than, the 2 pitted ware ones. So, that's the part I kind of struggle with. And the other thing as well, and this issue is kind of more with like, there's all the arguments back and forth about radiocarbon dating and the issues like how much does the, kind of like water effect have on a lot of these dating. But you have this like second group of, because first you have the Badalax culture, then you have kind of like that Northwestern European Bellbeaker group that takes over Scandinavia around like 2200 BC. And that, like, the takeover of that group is associated with the end of the, pitted ware Scandinavian hunter-gatherers. Like, why didn't, the I haplogroup get introgressed into that population? Why was it, this third group that's coming from apparently the Eastern Baltic? So, my guess is there's a missing I1 in, the Middle Neolithic Latvia, but we'll see. I could be wrong. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Wasian Hotep, you were good to speak.
Do they completely wipe out the Celtic population that existed? Do they intermix with them? Do they just push them back? Or what really happened?
In the beginning, I think it was like a 40% population replacement in East Anglia. And then over time, that got kind of diluted around to 30% in all of England. So they clearly made like an outsized, genetic contribution relative to their initial numbers, but it wasn't like, genocide by any means. It was just probably like a gradual series of coastal raids, slowly expanding coastal settlements, concubinage, whatnot.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, actually, kind of take that back. Like everyone in London basically died. Like the urban populations were totally killed off. But it was like the rural Celtic populations that weren't totally Romanized definitely contribute a lot of ancestry to modern English. Because you have stuff like there's a West African they found, or someone who's like a quarter West African they found from the 5th century. And those populations are just all gone. All right, Murat, carry on. You were good to speak.
Hey, what's up, Nemets? Sorry if this question's a little bit out of left field because it's more linguistics, but I want to know how much stock you give the Germanic substrate hypothesis. Familiar?
I'm familiar with it. I'm not a linguist, so I'm not really qualified to answer that by any means. There's definitely a lot of possibilities for where it could have come from. You could have had like this Middle Neolithic Latvian population, which was very clearly intermarrying sometimes on equal status with these Indo-European peoples in the Baltic. It could be from the globular amphora people, who mixed in with the Indo-Europeans at various points. Could be from one of the two preceding Indo-European groups in Scandinavia. It's hard to say. So it's possible. I don't necessarily know if it's true, though. Graf York, you were good to speak. Graf York, you there?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry. I wanted to know what was the relationship like between the Western Germanic and Eastern Germanic tribes? Did they eventually forget about each other? Did the Goths know about the Franks? What was their relationship like?
I think they split up pretty early on after, you have the expansion of the Proto-Germanics onto the European continent. I think it was like, 500, 600 BC? So there were definitely, like the Saxons remembered who they were, the Goths remembered who they were, but there wasn't like a pan-Germanic identity by any means. I think you some stuff like around, you have like the Alemanni and whatnot, where they do have kind of like a pan-Western Germanic identity in a sense. And even earlier than that, the whole thing with like Hermann, the guy who led that, Teutoburg forest and whatnot. It's complicated. But like in general, I think the East Germanic tribes and West Germanic tribes were like separate part.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Bitpundit, were you requesting to speak again?
Yeah, I had a kind of a thought on is there obviously the Germans that covered a vast area from the Baltics down to the Swiss Alps, but are there I'm thinking of like the Latin if the Germans are the Latins, are there any groups that seem to be like the Etruscans where they were a non-PIE people group that we can tell had even if they were conquered, that they had some kind of reverse influence on the Germanic people in that area?
That's the argument behind the Germanic substrate hypothesis, but the area was pre-literate until I think the like 3rd or 2nd century. So yeah, I don't think we'll ever know, honestly. Anyone else want to speak or ask a question?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I know that you didn't talk that much about ages, but as far as you know, was there like a pan-German like sense of identity at all? Because I know from just reading about like the various Italian city-states, like a lot of intellectuals, I know this is a lot later, but still, like Niccolo Machiavelli, definitely had the sense of like pan-Italian identity, even though there was nothing resembling actual political unification. Do you know if there was anything similar to that to the various German peoples in the Middle Ages?
There was definitely a concept of a German nation. Like the Holy Roman Emperors would have to be the king of Germany before they could be the Holy Roman Emperor. And there's kind of like in the Protestant Reformation, you have people like Luther who are really annoyed that they're having to pay tithes to these Latins, and then also resented these kind of like Slavic barbarians who were hanging around the hinterlands of Württemberg. I don't think it was necessarily like a mass appeal type thing, like 19th or 20th century romantic nationalism, but there was like some sort of conception of specifically German unity.
And going off that, do you know, like before, like the 19th and 18th centuries, like was there any sense of like the English or Dutch as being like a Germanic people included in that?
There was like a pan-Saxon identity, and there are tribal links between the different Saxon groups all the way up until like the early 9th century, I think. But those, there's no like pan-German thing, no.
Okay, cool. I didn't think so. I was just curious.
Anyone else want to speak?
Yes, if I may.
Sure.
Why do you think that the Eastern Germans disappear when the Western ones were pretty successful at preserving their identity?
Because the Eastern Germans had to face the Huns. I mean, Ukraine's just a much less defensible area than, like Germany proper, and especially both of them much less so than Scandinavia. Niels, your speak. Niels, are you there? Okay, if it is necessary, you are now good to speak.
Hey, do you mind talking a little bit about you were talking about the Anglo, the Nordic kind of invasion of England around the 5th century. Do you mind just if I ask a question about that?
Sure.
Yeah, so I just wanted to I don't know too much about it. I've been doing some research on it recently. To my understanding, it's that the kind of Nordic Danish people, from that area, they kind of came into England and they were kind of pushed back by the native Britons to being kind of kept on the coast. I think the kind of legend of King Arthur and whatnot was about the native Britons pushing them to the coast. So really what I'm just kind of asking about is, was it really conquering England entirely, or was it just all of those kind of Danish groups just kind of moving into the parts of England that they weren't pushed out of? Just more knowledge about that in general, I guess.
I mean, it wasn't just Danish. It was, like the main group, I think, was from Frisia specifically, since Frisian is the language that's closest to English of all the, Western Germanic languages. Um, I mean, there clearly was like a gradual conquest over the centuries. I'm not super sure on the specifics, and not even sure if historians have necessarily figured out the path. Maybe I could research into it and figure it out, though.
Oh yeah, sure thing. And yeah, I said Danish. I didn't really know what to call the kind of modern Dutch area. But yeah, thank you.
I mean, I will add though that one of like the House of Wessex, for instance, I think its earliest two known rulers, for instance, actually had Celtic names. So there were like quite a few Celts who assimilated into Anglo-Saxon society, because that was the dominant society, almost like probably because it just had more sea power. They were connected to the trade routes. They had the access to, the various like plunder and whatnot. So it was more of like a give and take kind of thing rather than just a straight up conquest, I think would be a better way of putting it. Although there was definitely a tremendous amount of violence and destruction and, population movement.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, from what I've seen as well, it was really that, I mean, there was probably a lot of conquest from the Danish people in the, century after the fall of the Roman Empire. Um, but would you say that it was really in the 11th century when kind of the uh, outside invaders kind of officially completely took over England?
I don't know, honestly. I mean, my understanding was it was the 9th century when they'd kind of consolidated their hold over everything.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, thank you very much.
I'm trying to add you, Niels, but for some reason it's not letting me. All right, guys. Well, thank you all very, very much for joining in. I hope you learned something. If you have any other questions, comments, criticisms, feel free to shoot me a DM or tag me in a tweet. Hope you all enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Or, Niels, try speaking now. Is it working or no? Yeah, Niels, send me a DM when this is over and we can just talk about it that way. It's not letting you speak for some reason.